Hey everybody, this is Erica Penrod and I'm going to be presenting on the micronutrient vitamin B12. Another name for that is cobalamin. So to start off, vitamin B12 is kind of unique for a vitamin. It's the only one that's got a mineral secure in its structure. You can see right here that it's this red CO right there's the cobalamin in the center of vitamin B12. It's also unique that it is not found in any plant foods. It is unique only in animal foods. The RDA for adults is 2.4 micrograms per day, and the daily value is 6 micrograms. If you can imagine where this is found in meat, we as Americans typically exceed that RDA. Men at about 6.3 micrograms per day and women at 4.6 micrograms per day. There's not currently an upper limit for vitamin B12, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later. Oh, some of the major functions of vitamin B12, and this is a pretty important and varied list. Vitamin B12 is required for proper red blood cell formation. It has an impact on your neurological function. It plays a part in DNA synthesis, and it also is a little bit unique to fatty acid metabolism, specifically for odd-numbered carbon chain fatty acids. So you can see that vitamin B12 is used in a lot of different ways in the body. As I said before, the major food sources of vitamin B12 are from animals. So your meat, poultry, seafood, eggs, and dairy products. Of course, we've fortified some things with it as well. The especially rich sources are your organ meats, such as liver, kidneys, and heart, as well as those fortified foods like the ready-to-eat cereal and breads and stuff. Deficiency and toxicity. Like I said, no upper limit has been set for vitamin B12 because no harmful effects have been observed. Deficiencies, however, in vitamin B12 are fairly common, and they can range, maybe not common, but not rare. They can range from mild to severe. The severe malabsorption or insufficient intrinsic factor production. I should mention, intrinsic factor is required for the absorption of vitamin B12. And if you don't have that, that can lead to pernicious anemia. Pernicious anemia is an autoimmune disease that affects the gastric mucosa and results in gastric atrophy. This can lead to the destruction of the parietal cells, the cells on the inside of the stomach, achlorhydria, so not enough of the hydrochloric acid, which contains the intrinsic factor, and subsequently the failure to produce intrinsic factor. So this is kind of a self-compounding problem because that causes vitamin B12 malabsorption. Untreated, this pernicious anemia will result in megaloblastic anemia and neurological disorders, even in the presence of sufficient dietary B12. So, because of that intrinsic factor, excuse me, even if you're eating enough foods with vitamin B12, if you have an issue with the intrinsic factor, you're going to not be absorbing enough B12. So because of this, there are some particularly susceptible populations. The elderly commonly have issues with low production of hydrochloric acid, so they're not making enough intrinsic factor. Anybody with a malabsorption disorder, and that can be caused by medications or stomach surgeries, anything that's messed with that hydrochloric acid and the intrinsic factor production. And then vegetarians and vegans, especially, are at the highest risk for developing vitamin B12 because they don't consume any of those animal products. So those are people who should definitely consider a vitamin B12 supplement. But as I said before, besides the vegans, most people who have a vitamin B12 deficiency, it's going to be caused by a problem with intrinsic factor, not necessarily their vitamin B12 intake, because we commonly eat quite a bit of meat and foods containing vitamin B12. So the nutrients function in metabolism. As I talked about before, it's got a lot of functions, but the two main enzyme reactions that require B12 The first plays into that DNA and RNA regulation, kind of a complex series of steps, but vitamin B12 coenzyme methylcobalamin is required to create the enzyme methionine synthase, which forms the amino acid methionine from the amino acid homocysteine. The resulting methionine is used in this S-adenosyl methionine, which serves as a methyl donor in methylation reactions important to the DNA regulation, myelin regulation, which is the sheath around your nerves that kind of insulates them to make sure that impulses are communicated properly, and then kind of the catch-all in the synthesis of many biochemical compounds. So this pathway links folate and vitamin B12. When you've got low B12, that reduces your folate byproducts as well, and it causes symptoms of folate deficiency. So sometimes it can be tricky to diagnose what you're actually deficient in based solely on symptoms. So the second important reaction, or enzyme reaction that vitamin B12 is a part of is forming this coenzyme 5-deoxyadenylyl cobalamin, which is required by the enzyme methylmalonyl mutase. This is what I was talking about, the fatty acid breakdown. This enzyme is used in the breakdown of irregular fatty acids containing an odd number of carbon molecules. These are fairly rare. This enzyme allows the fatty acids to be oxidized through the citric acid cycle and provide energy to the body. One of the most interesting things I learned was in my reading, I talked about how there's not an upper limit for B12, but I thought this was kind of contradicting. In the same readings that said there's no harmful effect, I read that while vitamins B12 and B6 have been indicated in helping to prevent cancer, there's also research suggesting that really high intakes of these nutrients may promote tumor growth. And one study in particular found that men only, not women, for them in this study, vitamin B12 supplements are not only not chemoprotective for lung cancer, but they may even be harmful. So I thought that was interesting. Vitamin B12 is definitely, I would say, kind of a hot topic in nutrition right now. It's sometimes labeled as a little bit of a magic bullet, that it will give you more energy and it will fix all these different ailments. So it's fairly trendy to be taking B12, but this is definitely something that needs more research done to be sure that in trying to prevent cancer, you're not making it worse. Another article that I read that I found interesting was that sometimes in those older adults, vitamin B12 deficiency can create symptoms that are similar to those of Alzheimer's. This study showed that they took a group of people with Alzheimer's, a group of people with the B12 deficiency, and they followed them for several years. And they found that while the symptoms were very similar, the disease process was different, and that the B12 therapy can somewhat reverse the symptoms in those suffering from the B12 deficiency, but as opposed to those with Alzheimer's. So that's something interesting to consider when those symptoms of Alzheimer's show up, that may not be the only cause. So in conclusion, I feel like it's pretty basic and applies across the board to most vitamins and minerals, but we need to just be aware of our intake, try to consume a varied diet that contains sufficient amounts of B12, get a variety of meats, seafoods, and milk, as well as fortified foods. And particularly if you or someone you're caring for is in one of those sensitive populations, someone elderly, a vegetarian or vegan, or anybody with an absorption issue from a medication or surgical, whatever situation, those people should definitely consider supplementation with their vitamin B12, but that should be done carefully under the supervision of a primary care provider or a nutritionist. And these are my references, and thanks for watching.